There's a difference between accepting something and actually loving it, and most people, when they talk about being at peace with a difficult situation, are really only describing the first, weaker version. They mean something closer to resignation, a grudging tolerance, the sense of having stopped fighting a fact they can't change, while privately still wishing, somewhere underneath the acceptance, that things had gone differently. This is not nothing. Resignation is genuinely better than active, ongoing resistance to an unchangeable fact. But the Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, pointed towards something considerably more demanding and considerably more useful than mere resignation, an idea that later got a memorable Latin name, amor fati, the love of fate, though the concept itself is older than the phrase, sitting at the very center of how the Stoics thought a person should actually relate to everything that happens to them, the good and the difficult alike. The claim is genuinely strange when you first encounter it. Strange enough that it's worth sitting with the discomfort rather than rushing past it toward a comfortable, watered-down version. The claim is not simply that you should tolerate hardship with dignity, or that you should look for a silver lining once the dust settles. The claim is that a person practicing this discipline fully should, in some real sense, actually want what happened to have happened, not despite the difficulty it caused, but including the difficulty, treating even the hardest parts of their life as something they would not choose to have gone differently, if they could somehow go back and choose again with full knowledge of everything that followed. This sounds, on first hearing, almost impossible or worse, faintly insulting to anyone who has actually suffered something serious. Nobody wants to hear, in the immediate aftermath of a genuine tragedy, that they should somehow come to love what happened. So it's worth being precise, right from the start, about what this idea is actually claiming and what it's explicitly not claiming, because the gap between the caricature and the actual teaching is enormous, and most of the value in this idea lives specifically in that gap. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in his private notebook, about a specific mental orientation he tried to cultivate toward events, a willingness not merely to endure whatever fate assigned him, but to actively welcome it, treating each circumstance, however difficult, as material specifically suited to the exercise of some virtue, courage in the face of danger, patience in the face of frustration, wisdom in the face of confusion, justice in the face of another person's wrongdoing. This reframe is worth unpacking slowly, because it contains the entire mechanism by which amor fati is actually supposed to work, rather than simply being an aspirational, feel-good slogan with no real practical content behind it. The core move is this: rather than evaluating an event purely by whether it was pleasant or unpleasant, easy or difficult, Marcus proposed evaluating it by whether it provided an opportunity to exercise virtue, since virtue, in the Stoic framework, was the one genuine good available to a human being, the one thing capable of making a life actually good regardless of external circumstances. And here's the crucial insight that makes the whole idea work rather than collapsing into either denial or empty positive thinking. Difficult events, precisely because they're difficult, tend to provide considerably more opportunity for the exercise of virtue than easy, comfortable ones do. A comfortable, frictionless life offers relatively few occasions to practice courage, since courage specifically requires the presence of something frightening or dangerous to be courageous about. It offers relatively few occasions to practice patience, since patience specifically requires something frustrating or slow-moving to be patient with. A life of ease, on this specific dimension, is actually a life comparatively poor in opportunities for the very thing the Stoics consider the sole genuine good. This reframe doesn't deny that difficulty is difficult. It doesn't claim that pain isn't painful or that loss isn't real loss. What it claims is that difficulty, examined honestly, is never purely one-dimensionally bad, because difficulty is also, simultaneously, the raw material through which virtue actually gets built and demonstrated. Courage cannot exist in a vacuum, disconnected from anything to be courageous about. It only becomes real and demonstrable in the presence of genuine danger or fear. This means that from a very specific angle, the angle the Stoics care about most, a genuinely frightening situation is not simply an obstacle standing between you and the virtue of courage. It is the actual, necessary condition for courage to exist at all. Remove the danger, and courage has nothing left to be courage about. Let's make this concrete with something almost everyone has experienced in some form. A serious setback at work, a project that failed publicly, a role that was eliminated, a plan that collapsed after months of investment. The ordinary, natural response to this kind of event is to evaluate it purely along the dimension of pleasant versus unpleasant, and by that measure, the event registers as straightforwardly bad, something you'd erase from your history if you had the power to do so. Amor fati asks a different, more demanding question. What did this specific difficulty make possible, in terms of who you actually became, that an easier path would not have made possible? Did the setback force you to develop a level of resilience you didn't previously have? Did it force an honest reckoning with weaknesses in your approach that success would have let you comfortably ignore for years longer? Did it create space, however unwanted at the time, for a different path that turned out, on later reflection, to matter more to you than the original plan ever would have? It's crucial to be honest here that this reframe does not always resolve neatly, and pretending it does would be dishonest to the actual difficulty of practicing this idea in real life. Sometimes a setback simply is what it appears to be, a loss with no redeeming silver lining that ever fully justifies it, and forcing a tidy, positive narrative onto genuine tragedy can itself become a kind of dishonesty, a refusal to sit with real grief in favor of a premature, unearned resolution. The Stoics were not asking for this kind of forced positivity, and it's worth distinguishing amor fati sharply from a much shallower modern habit of insisting that everything happens for a reason, a phrase that often functions less as genuine philosophy and more as a way of avoiding the discomfort of sitting with events that simply are what they are, difficult, sometimes senseless, sometimes not obviously redeemable by anything that follows. What amor fati actually asks is narrower and, in a strange way, more honest in the everything happens for a reason framing. It doesn't claim the universe arranged your hardship specifically for your benefit, as though some cosmic plan justified the suffering in advance. It claims something more modest and more within your actual control, that whatever has already happened, having already happened and being now unchangeable, is best met not with continued resistance to the fact of it having happened, but with a full, active commitment to making something genuinely worthwhile out of what remains available to you now. This is a claim about your relationship to the present and future, built on top of an unchangeable past, rather than a claim about the past having been secretly good all along. The distinction matters enormously, because it removes the dishonest requirement to pretend a genuine tragedy was actually a hidden blessing, while still offering a genuinely useful orientation toward what comes next. There's a specific image Marcus Aurelius used that captures this distinction well, describing the way a skilled craftsman works with whatever material happens to be in front of them, rather than the material they might have wished for instead. A sculptor working with a flawed block of stone, containing a crack or an unexpected vein of harder rock running through it, doesn't simply stop working because the material isn't the pristine, ideal block they might have preferred. A genuinely skilled sculptor incorporates the flaw, works with it, sometimes builds an entire composition specifically designed around the very imperfection that a less skilled craftsman would have experienced only as an obstacle. Marcus's suggestion is that a person's relationship to difficult circumstances should function the same way. The circumstance itself, the setback, the loss, the unwanted diagnosis, the plan that collapsed, is a block of stone you've actually been given, not the one you would have chosen if given an unlimited catalog of options. The question worth asking is not how to somehow acquire a different, more convenient block of stone, since that option was never actually available to begin with. The question is what the most skilled possible response looks like, given exactly this material, flaws and all. This connects to a deeper piece of Stoic physics, and it's worth including here even briefly, because it explains why the ancient Stoics felt genuinely justified in this demanding claim, rather than simply offering it as a comforting trick. The Stoics held a broadly deterministic view of the universe, believing that events unfold according to a chain of prior causes stretching back indefinitely, meaning that, in a strict sense, the specific difficulty you're currently facing was, in some real sense, always going to happen, given everything that came before it. This metaphysical position isn't something a modern person needs to fully adopt in order to get practical value from amor fati, but it's worth understanding as a background reasoning, because it explains why resisting an already completed event struck the Stoics as not merely unpleasant but genuinely irrational, a form of arguing with arithmetic that has already been calculated and cannot be recalculated by wishing hard enough. If the past is, by definition, fixed and unchangeable, then energy spent wishing had gone differently is energy spent on something that offers zero possible return, no matter how intensely or how long that wishing continues. The energy is not neutral, either. It's actively being subtracted from whatever energy remains available for the one thing that actually is still open to influence: how you respond to the situation you're now actually in. Let's take this out of the abstract entirely and apply it to a specific, ordinary modern scenario, walking through it in enough detail to see exactly how the reframe changes the texture of the experience rather than simply describing it as a nice idea in general terms. Picture someone who has just gone through an unwanted breakup, a relationship that ended not by their own choice, leaving them with a particular, specific pain of rejection layered on top of ordinary heartbreak. The ordinary response here, and a completely understandable one, involves extended replaying the relationship, searching for what went wrong, wishing intensely that things had unfolded differently, sometimes for months or longer. Amor fati doesn't ask this person to pretend the breakup didn't hurt, or to immediately declare gratitude for an experience that, in the moment, feels purely like loss. What it asks, once the most acute period of grief has had room to move through honestly, since grief itself is not something the Stoics believe should be suppressed or rushed, is a specific redirection of attention. Given that this relationship has, in fact, ended, and given that no amount of wishing will unend it, what does the most skilled, most virtuous possible response to this specific situation actually look like? This might mean examining honestly, without excessive self-blame but without excessive self-protection either, what patterns in a relationship are worth understanding more clearly before entering another one. It might mean noticing, honestly, whether some part of the person actually feels a kind of relief mixed in with the grief, relief that had been difficult to access while still inside a relationship that, on some level, wasn't working, even before it visibly ended. It might mean treating the unstructured time that now exists, time that used to be filled by the relationship, as genuine raw material for something the person had been quietly neglecting: a friendship, a creative project, a version of themselves that had gotten smaller inside the shape of the previous relationship without them fully noticing it happening. None of this requires declaring dishonestly that the breakup was secretly wonderful all along. It requires something more modest and more achievable. Treating the situation as it actually now stands, unchangeable in its basic fact, as a material available to work with, and asking what the most skilled possible response to that specific material actually looks like, rather than continuing to direct energy toward a version of events that no longer exists and was never actually available to be chosen once the breakup had already happened. There's a particular quote from Marcus Aurelius worth unpacking carefully here, paraphrased in translations vary considerably, where he describes reminding himself that whatever happens to him is either within the ordinary, expected course of nature, and therefore nothing to be surprised by, or to resist, or else genuinely beyond what any human being could have anticipated or prevented, in which case resistance is equally pointless, since no amount of wishing changes what has already occurred. This framing offers a useful diagnostic for distinguishing between two very different situations that often get emotionally confused with one another. Some difficulties are, in fact, preventable in the future, even if the specific instance already happened, and part of a skilled response involves genuinely learning from them, adjusting behavior, building better systems, so that similar difficulties are less likely going forward. Other difficulties are simply not preventable by any reasonable standard. Genuine bad luck, other people's choices entirely outside your influence, the ordinary unpredictability built into being a person living among billions of other people and an indifferent physical universe. Amor fati applies to both categories, but in slightly different ways. For the preventable category, loving your fate includes genuinely learning from it, treating the difficulty as valuable specifically because it revealed something worth changing. For the unpreventable category, loving your fate means something closer to accepting that some difficulties exist purely as tests of character, offering nothing to be learned in terms of future prevention, but offering everything in terms of how skillfully you choose to meet them anyway. It's worth being honest about the genuine limits of this practice, too, because oversoul philosophy tends to collapse the first time it meets a hardship serious enough to actually test it. Amor fati is not a technique that instantly transforms grief into gratitude, or those experiencing genuine trauma into people who feel nothing but appreciation for what happened to them. Even Marcus Aurelius, who wrote about this discipline more consistently than perhaps any other Stoic figure, still recorded across his private notebook genuine struggle, genuine frustration, genuine moments where the discipline clearly wasn't coming easily, moments he was actively working to talk himself through rather than moments where philosophy had already fully done its work and required no further effort. This detail matters considerably, because it suggests amor fati was never meant to describe an instantly achieved state so much as an ongoing practice, something returned to repeatedly, imperfectly, over years, rather than a switch that gets flipped once and remains permanently on afterward. The practical version of this practice, usable on an ordinary day without requiring the full weight of ancient metaphysics to back it up, might look something like this. The next time something goes wrong, something you didn't want, didn't choose, and cannot undo, notice the initial automatic wish for things to have gone differently, and let that wish exist honestly for as long as it genuinely needs to, without rushing to suppress or override it. Then, once that initial wave has had room to move through, ask the more demanding, more useful question underneath it. Given that this has already happened, and given that wishing it hadn't changes nothing about the fact that it did, what would the most skilled, most admirable possible response to exactly the situation actually look like? Not the response to the situation you wish you were facing instead. The response to the specific, actual situation now in front of you, flaws, difficulty, and all, treated the way a skilled craftsman treats the actual block of material in their hands, rather than the ideal block they might have wished for instead. Let's slow down and walk through a full, specific example, because this idea tends to remain frustratingly abstract until you actually watch someone apply it in detail to something genuinely difficult rather than a mild inconvenience easy to feel philosophical about from a safe distance. Picture someone in their late 30s who has spent over a decade building a career as a competitive athlete, someone whose entire adult identity, up to this point, has been organized around a specific physical capability, speed, strength, endurance, whatever particular sport happened to require. Then, through an injury sustained in a single, ordinary training session, nothing dramatic or unusual, simply an accumulation of stress finally reaching a breaking point, that capability is permanently, irreversibly reduced. The career that had defined this person's sense of self for their entire adult life is essentially over, not through any failure of effort or character, but through the ordinary, unglamorous mechanics of a body that turned out to have limits nobody could have precisely predicted in advance. The ordinary response here, entirely understandable and not something to be rushed past, involves a period of genuine grief, frustration, anger at the unfairness of the timing, replaying the specific training session repeatedly, wondering whether some different choice might have prevented the injury, wishing, with real intensity, for a version of events where this simply hadn't happened. This period of grief is not something a more fatty asks anyone to skip, and it's worth being explicit about that. It's an aversion of this philosophy that demands instant, cheerful acceptance would be neither honest nor genuinely useful to someone actually living through something that's disorienting. But at some point, and there's no fixed timeline for when this point arrives, since grief moves at its own pace and cannot be scheduled by philosophy, this person faces the same fork in the road every difficult event eventually presents. One path involves continuing to organize identity and attention primarily around the loss, around the career that ended, around a version of life that would have continued if the injury hadn't happened. A path that, while completely understandable, tend to leave a person permanently oriented backward, measuring every subsequent day against a version of the future that no longer exists and cannot be recovered by any amount of continued grief. The other path, the one a more fatty points toward, involves a difficult but ultimately more workable redirection. Treating the injury, now that it has already happened and cannot be undone, as the actual current material available to build a life from, rather than the material that was lost. In practice, for our composite athlete, this might mean discovering, sometimes with real surprise, that skills developed over a decade of serious athletic training, discipline, focus under pressure, the capacity to work patiently toward a distant goal, transferred directly into an entirely different field, coaching, sports science, business, something that would never have been actively pursued had the original career continued uninterrupted. It might mean discovering a different relationship to physical movement altogether, one built around enjoyment rather than competition, that turns out, on honest reflection years later, to bring a kind of satisfaction competitive career, for all its intensity, never quite offered. None of this makes the original loss less real, and a person genuinely practicing amor fati is not required to pretend the injury was secretly a gift they're grateful for in any simple sense. What changes is not the fact of the loss, but the relationship to what remains an active, engaged commitment to building something genuinely worthwhile out of the actual circumstances now in front of them, rather than a life spent primarily mourning circumstances that are no longer available to be chosen. This story illustrates something important about how amor fati actually functions in practice, distinct from how it's sometimes caricatured. It doesn't require the person to have wanted the injury, or to claim dishonestly that their life is now better than it would have been without it, a claim that's often genuinely unknowable and not really the point in any case. It requires something more specific and more achievable. A refusal to let an unchangeable fact about the past continue to consume energy and attention that could otherwise be directed toward building something genuinely good out of the present, which remains, unlike the past, still fully open to influence. There's a specific historical figure worth mentioning here, not from the Stoic tradition directly, but someone the Stoics themselves frequently referenced as an example of exactly this kind of resilience. The Roman general and statesman who, having lost the use of an eye in battle and suffered other serious injuries over a long military career, was known for continuing to serve with apparently undiminished effectiveness and, by most ancient accounts, undiminished good humor, treating his injuries as simply part of the accumulated cost of a life spent doing work he considered genuinely worthwhile, rather than as a permanent grievance to be nursed. Whatever the exact historical details, and ancient biographical accounts of this kind should always be read with some skepticism about their precision. The function this kind of story served for Stoic writers was consistent: to demonstrate that a genuinely difficult, permanent physical loss did not have to become the organizing center of a person's remaining life, that it was possible, demonstrated by actual examples rather than only theorized about, to sustain both genuine competence and genuine good humor, even after suffering harm, that most people would consider more than sufficient grounds for permanent bitterness. Let's return to the specific quote from Marcus Aurelius mentioned earlier and unpack it a bit further, because there's a layer to it worth drawing out more fully. His reminder that events are either within the ordinary course of nature or else genuinely unprecedented and unpreventable carries an implicit, useful diagnostic question worth actually asking out loud the next time something difficult happens. Is this the kind of thing that happens to people as an ordinary, if unwelcome, part of being alive? Or does it genuinely fall outside any reasonable expectation of what a normal human life might include? Illness happens to people. Financial setbacks happen to people. Relationships end. Careers change course, sometimes involuntarily. Bodies age and eventually fail. None of these are pleasant, and none of this framing is meant to suggest they should be received with indifference. But naming them honestly as things that happen to people, rather than as personal injustices specifically targeting you in particular, changes the emotional texture of the experience in a way that's genuinely available to test for yourself. There's a specific kind of additional suffering that comes from believing you've been singled out, treated worse than the ordinary run of human experience would predict, and Marcus's reframe offers a way of setting that additional layer aside, not because the difficulty itself becomes less real, but because a specific, extra weight of feeling cosmically singled out turns out, on close examination, to rarely be supported by anything beyond the natural human tendency to experience our own difficulties as uniquely significant. Let's turn this into something genuinely practical. A specific sequence of questions worth actually working through the next time you're facing something you didn't choose and cannot undo. First, allow whatever grief, frustration, or disappointment is genuinely present to exist honestly, without rushing to skip past it in the name of philosophical composure, since Marcus Aurelius himself, by his own private admission, did not manage to skip this step either. Second, once that initial wave has had genuine room to move, ask directly whether this is a kind of difficulty that offers something to learn for the future, a pattern worth adjusting, a system worth building, or whether it belongs instead to the category of genuine bad luck, unpreventable by any reasonable standard, in which case the useful question shifts entirely away from prevention and toward response. Third, and this is a step that actually constitutes the practice of a more fatty, rather than simply ordinary problem solving, ask what the specific, actual material now in front of you, exactly as it now stands, difficult and unwanted as it may be, makes possible that would not have been possible without it. This third question does not require an answer to arrive immediately, and sometimes the honest answer, for a period of time, is that nothing yet feels possible, that the material still feels purely like loss without any visible opening. That's a legitimate answer too, at least temporarily. The practice is in continuing to hold the question open, returning to it periodically, rather than either forcing a premature, dishonest answer or abandoning the question entirely in favor of permanent, unexamined grievance. This is, in the end, a considerably more demanding practice than simple acceptance, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty rather than pretending the idea is easy simply because it can be stated in a single memorable phrase. It's worth drawing one final, important distinction before closing, because amor fati sits in a crowded neighborhood of similar-sounding ideas, some of which are genuinely different from what the Stoics were actually describing, and mistaking one for another tends to either water the practice down into something useless or distort it into something the Stoics never actually endorsed.